In this video, I'm going to build on everything I've said in the previous videos, and I'm going to try and sort of pull it together and give an overall view, because I realize I have given a lot of ideas, a lot of teachings, and it might seem overwhelming or even confusing to people. And perhaps that's the place to start, confusion. Because I remember myself when I first started really paying attention to this whole concept of ego, and I read books about it and spiritual teachings, and my first sense was just confusion. I mean, what is it? You know, the idea that I came across back in the 1980s was that the ego is, as I've said, this alien thing in my psychology that's hiding but still seeking to influence me, and it's difficult to see exactly what it is. So obviously I felt very confused. But what we can come to realize is that a big part of the reason why the ego seems a confusing topic and why duality can seem a confusing topic is precisely because, as I said in the last talk, the ego is schizophrenic. It's not consistent. It's difficult to define because it shifts all the time. It's the shapeshifter, it's the chameleon. And the ego will at 1 minute praise you and raise you up that you are a smart person because you are believing what the ego tells you. And in the next minute it'll put you down because you're stupid, you can't figure out truth on your own because you're doubting what the ego tells you. And the only constant there is that what the ego does not want you to do is use the ability that I've talked about to be self-aware, where the conscious you mentally steps outside your four lower bodies, your identity, mental, emotional, or physical body. You experience pure awareness, where you're just a silent witness observing what's happening in the world without the dualistic overlay, or you are contacting your higher self or the ascended masters in a higher realm. That is what the ego does not want you to do. The ego wants you to constantly be pulled inside your four lower bodies, experiencing the world and yourself through those four lower bodies. So that whatever question you have that comes up in your mind, whatever you are wondering about, the ego wants you to see it through some kind of filter that it can control. Some kind of filter that was created in this world. And so I remember for many years it was very, very confusing to me why the ego was created, where it came from, how it arose. And as I've described, it took me a while to realize that I created it by making certain choices. But it took me much longer to realize that in a sense you could say there's nothing wrong with the ego. As I've said, the ego has the function of giving you a certain type of experience. Right? So the first thing we have to recognize here, which the ego will often seek to confuse, is that you have free will. Now, the ego will often claim that you don't have free will because it doesn't want you to exercise your will freely. It wants you to exercise your will in a way that the ego can influence. But nevertheless, as I've explained, the conscious you does have free will. It can choose, and it has self-awareness, so it can make choices. It can look at itself and say, do I want to continue doing this pattern, repeating this pattern, or do I want to change myself? And that's what the ego cannot do. Cannot mentally step outside itself. So you have free will, but this is a confusing topic because is your will really free? So can you, when I say free will, I've noticed many people, they interpret this to mean I can do anything I want. But that's never the case. We never have free will in the sense that we can do anything, because we can only choose among options we can see. And what we can see depends on our level of consciousness, our level of awareness. So that's why I'm saying that essentially you can say that when you see yourself as a connected being, you have a free will in the sense that you can choose to expand your sense of connection. You can also choose to go into separation. And that's a choice you can make. There's nothing that forces you to go into separation. It's a choice you're making. But once you go into separation, you've created the ego which can only see duality, dualistic polarities. You really don't have free will anymore. Because if you can only choose among dualistic polarities, your will isn't free. So you can say that in order to exercise free will, you have to have some contact with what I call the one mind, or the Christ mind, or the Buddha nature. And you have to be aware, and this is what you get when you contact the Christ mind, you experience there's something outside your own mind that's real. So then you have a free choice between reality and what you create in your own mind. When you go into duality and separation, all you can see is what's created in duality. So all you can see is an illusion, meaning you can choose between this illusion or that illusion. But you're choosing within the realm of illusion. So this is what the ego does not want you to realize. It doesn't want you to realize there's an alternative to duality. And this is tricky. I mean, this is subtle to grasp. I remember struggling with this for years before I really could see it. And but it's really worth considering. So I just recently was watching some YouTube videos from some of these non-dual teachers that were talking about reality versus illusion. And there's been a long-standing, of course, debate among philosophers and spiritual teachers, what's real and what's unreal, what's reality and what's an illusion. And there are various, of course, viewpoints out there, various arguments, but what I see so far from everything I've seen in my many years on the spiritual path is that very, very few people have grasped what duality really is and how it distorts the way we look at everything. And the reason for this is, in fact, relatively simple. It's like I said in my last video. If you really step back and say, what is separation and duality? Well, it's just an experience. It's an experience you cannot have when you see yourself as a connected being. And as I've said, the reality of the universe is that everything is connected. Everything is part of one whole. There is no separation in reality. That's why you can only experience separation through an illusion. In order to experience that you are a separate being, and in order for that experience to seem real, you must go into a state of delusion, because in reality there's no separation. And that's what you sense when you are a connected being. And as you expand your sense of connection, you become more and more aware of it, why it is that everything is connected. You experience that you are connected to everything. So, so that means that we can now ask ourselves the question, which again is very rarely asked in spiritual or religious or even these non-dual teachings, what's the purpose of our existence? As I mentioned, some non-dual teachers and some Eastern religions make it seem like we came out of the undifferentiated Brahman, we have thousands of incarnations here on earth, or we suffer in many of these lifetimes, and then when we awaken from this Maya, this illusion, we supposedly disappear as individual beings, go back into the Atman or Brahman or infinite awareness, whatever you call it. So, based on this, there seems to be no purpose. As I've said, when I was in my early 20s and I encountered some of these Eastern teachings that talk about this, and I had some experiences of going outside my normal state of consciousness, I was really, really, I would say, traumatized by this. Because I couldn't, intuitively, it just didn't make sense to me that life didn't have a grander purpose to this. There had to be some kind of purpose for our existence. It couldn't all be for nothing. And so, as I've mentioned before, the purpose of our existence is our growth in self-awareness. So, you can say, you have a concept in the business world. You have a father who owns a big company, and he has a son, and he wants his son to take over the company one day. But he knows that he himself built the company from scratch. So he knows every level of the company and how it works. And the only way to be a good leader of the company is to know the company. So he wants his son to start from the bottom level as a worker and work his way up in the company, so that he, through experience, gets to know all the different levels of the company and how it functions. And it's essentially the same with the Creator who created our world of form and created us. We are created with a point-like sense of self in an unascended sphere, for example, on a planet like Earth or a natural planet. And our potential is to expand that sense of self by expanding our sense of connection to the whole. Therefore, coming to a greater and greater awareness. And we do this, as I said, by starting at the bottom level of the world of form and gradually working our way up through all the levels until we reach the greater consciousness. Then we have direct experience with how the world works and what makes a world function so it doesn't self-destruct. And that means that when we become creators, we have the option to create our own world. And now we have some experience so we can create a world that doesn't self-destruct after 5 minutes. Again, I mentioned science has discovered all these cosmological constants. If they were just a little bit different, the world couldn't exist. So how are you going to choose that particular balance if you don't have any experience? Okay, so once you realize this, you can say, okay, but how do I grow in awareness? Well, you grow by being in a certain environment, and in that environment you have certain options. And that means there are only certain options you can see. If it's a planet like Earth, for example, and you are in a human body, well, there are certain things you can do in a particular society. And so you grow by looking at the options that are available in your environment, making choices based on the options you see, and then you experience the consequences of those choices. And with the consequences, I don't mean just the physical outcome. In fact, I don't mean primarily the physical outcome. I mean your reaction to the outcome. Because by observing your reaction to the outcome, you can, first of all, evaluate, is this what I wanted to have happen? And if not, then I need to change the choices I made. But in order to really change the choices I made, I have to realize that the choice I made was not just a matter of the options that are out there, but also how I looked at those options. In other words, it's not primarily what's going on outside that determines my choice, but my own state of mind. So, for example, you make a choice and then you realize, oh, I didn't know enough about the situation. So I actually need to study it better before I make another choice. Or I was too hasty, I was too impatient, I was too optimistic, or whatever. It can be many, many things, but I'm just saying, the important thing is not what happens in the physical, but what happens in your mind. And why is that? Because you grow in consciousness through the experiences you are having. Basically, you can say, let's say you're born on earth, right? When you were born in this lifetime, you grew up, you had certain physical circumstances. But now think about this. If you accept reincarnation, you can say, 10 lifetimes ago, you were born in a completely different physical circumstance than you were in this lifetime. But that physical circumstance, let's say it was in the, 1500s. You were born as a peasant. Where is that physical circumstance today? Well, obviously it's not there, right? Society, the world has moved on. So what does it matter? What happened to you physically in that lifetime? What does that matter today? And therefore you can transfer that and say, well, if what happened back then didn't really matter, doesn't matter today, what about what happened to me in this life? Is that going to matter in my next lifetime? So what did matter in the lifetime you had in the 1500s? What mattered was the choices you made in the environment you were in and how those choices affected you. In other words, you were having an experience back then. And that experience shifted your sense of self, your level of awareness, your level of consciousness. And it's the same with this lifetime. What has happened to you in this lifetime, the physical circumstances, is not what is important. What is important is the experience that you have had in this lifetime and how this has affected your ongoing sense of self, your ongoing sense of awareness. Because the entire purpose of your existence is that you grow in self-awareness from where you started towards higher levels of consciousness, eventually the greater consciousness. And you grow through the experiences you are having. And you grow because you can make a choice. So, you're in a certain physical circumstance, it presents you with certain options, you choose one. You have a particular experience based on this. And you might say, well, I don't want that experience. And then you say, well, then I need to make another choice. But how do I make another choice? Well, ideally, you look at yourself, you look at what was it in your psychology, in your four lower bodies, that caused you to make the choice you made. And if you don't like the outcome of that choice, you change what it was in your psychology so you can make another choice. If you look at people who have, let's say they committed a crime, they will often say, I had no other choice, or I had no choice. But that's because there were options they couldn't see. And why couldn't they see them? Because, as I said, you have these structures, these subconscious selves in the four levels of your mind. And they block your vision. So there are people who can see, there's only one way to respond to a certain situation, that's with anger or violence. But that's because there's something in their psychology that blocks them from seeing the other options that were actually available. So the only way to change the choice is to look at yourself and change what's going on in your four lower bodies so you're free to make a higher choice. This, of course, is what the ego wants to prevent you from doing. But what I want to stay with here is we grow in self-awareness by making choices, but we always choose partly based on the external circumstances, but primarily based on the internal circumstances, what's going on in our psychology. Okay, so free will. We need to have free will in order to grow, because we grow by making choices. But there are two basic ways to exercise our free will, our will. And that is, as I said, based on whether we are separate beings or connected beings. We start out as connected beings, but all of us who are on earth have at some point in the past made the choice to go into separation and duality, and we did this why? Not because we were forced, but because we felt we wanted to have that experience. Now, when you look at all of the murder and mayhem that's going on earth, you may say, were we crazy for wanting to have this experience? Were we nuts? No. It's just that if you think about this in terms of the growth of a life stream, right? In order to really grow, you have to explore what you can do with your free will, or with your will, what choices you can make. And so, as I said, the reality is that we are connected beings. But one option we have is to create the experience in our own minds that we are separate beings. So you could say that when it comes to free will, we have two basic options. We can make choices based on our connection to something outside our own minds, a reality outside our own minds. Again, the one mind, the Christ mind, the Buddha nature. This is one way we can make choices. But we also have the option to make choices based on an experience that's created entirely inside our own minds. So in other words, there's a reality outside our minds that was not created by our minds. But our minds have the ability to create internally an experience that seems completely real when we're inside of it. And so what we can basically say is that in order to, well, let's step back a little bit and talk about what I've talked about in my video about how the world was created, that we actually start out our journey towards higher levels of consciousness in what I call an unascended sphere. There are several spheres that have ascended before ours. They make up the spiritual realm. But we live in an unascended sphere, and the reason for this is that in an unascended sphere, nothing is really permanent. You could say that an unascended sphere is comparable to a sandbox. You have a bunch of children who have limited experience with life, but they're playing in a sandbox. Why? Because they can't really hurt themselves by playing with the sand, and they can't hurt the sand. So it's the same in an unascended sphere. It's an experimental environment where we can explore what we can do with our imagination and free will and our self-awareness without really hurting ourselves permanently, without really hurting the world permanently. I know it may seem like on Earth we have hurt the world permanently, but it's not really the case, as I explained in my other videos. So what I'm saying is, you can look at our journey this way. We need to go through a phase where we are experimenting with free will. And as a result of that, we experiment with going into separation and duality. Until we have had enough of that experience. So we come to this point that I call the ascension, where now we can permanently ascend from this unascended sphere. We become ascended masters in the spiritual realm. But in order to ascend, we have to make one final decision. And that decision essentially is to permanently give up experimenting with separation and duality. In other words, we are saying, I've had enough of experiencing what it's like to be a separate being in a duality consciousness. Now I want to be an ascended being where I am one with, I have become one with the one mind. I become one with the whole. I see myself as part of a whole, and I'm seeking to raise the whole with everything I do, instead of seeking to raise the separate self. I've had enough of seeking to raise the separate self. I'm ready to work on raising the whole, which is what all beings in the ascended realm or in the spiritual realm are doing. So you see what I'm saying? In order to make that choice, we can't be forced to make that choice. We have to make it voluntarily and we have to make it consciously. But in order to make it, we have to have some experience with duality and separation. We have to know what it is before we can give it up. Okay, so once we realize this, and the purpose of life is to have experiences, we realize that we weren't stupid, we weren't nuts for going into duality. It was part of our growth that we determined we wanted to do this. We wanted to have that experience. And now we can then build on this and say, okay, but what is the experience we are having? We experience that we are separate beings, but as I said, everything is one interconnected whole. So, reality outside our minds hasn't been changed. It's like I've said before, 500 years ago, most people in Europe believed the earth was flat. But the earth was as round back then as it is today. People's belief did not change reality. This is a little confusing because people's minds have the ability to change certain things on earth, but there are certain things that our minds cannot change. And the shape of the earth, yeah, we just can't change it. So what I'm saying is that when we decided to go into separation, we did not become separate beings, which means separation is an experience that is entirely produced in our minds. Not just in our individual minds, because we live on a planet with 8 billion other people who are also in separation. And some of them have gone deeper into separation than we have. So collectively, we have created this illusion, and we enforce the illusion. So it's not just your mind, it's also, there's a collective mind that is quite powerful and persuasive. But nevertheless, separation is not a reality, it's an entirely internal experience. But what I've said is that in order to fully have an experience that we are separate beings, it must seem real that we are separate beings. It's like you go into a theater and you put on a costume, and now you're repeating the lines of a character in a play. But you know you're an actor, and half an hour ago you were outside the stage and you were wearing your normal clothes and didn't have the makeup on. So it's not a real experience. I mean, you can dress up like the humpback from Notre Dame and put on false teeth and a hump, but you know this is not who you are. So in order to really have the experience that you're a separate being, you have to forget that you're a connected being. That's why I'm saying the connected self dies, you're reborn as a separate sense of self. But that separate sense of self only exists in your mind, and that's why I'm saying the conscious you is still a connected being. It's just seeing itself through the filter of that separate self, but it has the ability to step outside of it. But for a time, the conscious you doesn't step outside because that's how you can have the experience. So when you realize this, you can realize that the ego is just a being or a structure in your mind that is meant to give you that specific experience that you are a separate being and make it seem real. The ego can't do anything else. To the ego, which is created out of separation and duality, separation is reality. It can't question it. Okay? The ego creates an illusion, projects that things are a certain way, and it can't question it. Now, why is that so important? Well, the ego, as I said, can only think in terms of duality. But duality always has the two opposite polarities, and there are gradations in between. So the ego responds to a particular situation you're in, like say a particular society, for example, where you are grown up in a Christian culture that projects Christianity is the only true religion. The Catholic Church is the only true religion. The ego then projects in your mind, creates the reality or the experience in your mind that you are a Christian, you are Catholic, and you'll be saved after this lifetime. And to the ego, this is complete reality. Now, it may be that at some point in your life, when you become an adult, you're exposed to, say, scientific materialism that questions the reality of the Christian religion or the existence of God. And it may be that you, because you're not completely blinded by your ego, you can see that there is something to this, or there's some inconsistency in the Christian religion or the view of God. Many people have had that experience, over, both in this lifetime and even in past lifetimes. So it may be that you come to a point where you actually doubt the ego's projection. In other words, you are saying, you're really experiencing, it's not real what the ego has been projecting so far in my first 25 years. It's not real that there is a God and that I'll be saved after this lifetime if I'm a good Catholic. But that doesn't mean the ego will give up, you see. The ego will then switch, and now it will project that everything scientific materialism says is real. Namely, you were not created by God, you are the result of a process of evolution, that you started, came from apes, and there's nothing you can do about it. Your consciousness is a product of your physical brain. So you see what the ego has done in one lifetime, it's shifted from one life experience that it projected was absolutely real to another. And now it's projecting, no, this one is real. So that's why I'm saying the ego will shape-shift. Whatever you are willing to believe is real, the ego will seem to validate it. And once you begin to see this, and I think most spiritual people have started to see this, because most of the spiritual people I met over my many years on the path, they started out being exposed to some kind of religion. And then at some point they were influenced by scientific materialism. But then at some point they started seeing the limitations of both of these viewpoints. In other words, they questioned the reality of both traditional religion and materialism, and that's why they became open to a spiritual path that leads to higher states of consciousness. Right? That's been the experience of many, many people I met. So, that means what? That means we have already seen that the ego will always project something, and then it will project that this is real. But it isn't. Right? As I've said, the ego thinks in dualistic terms. So it'll project one reality that's real and another that's unreal. But once you see through this, you can question, what if nothing that the ego comes up with is real? Because it's all dualistic. It's all disconnected from reality. And that's when you can really start asking yourself the question, okay, but if I, for many lifetimes on this planet Earth, where everything is so influenced of duality, or by duality, how can I free myself from this? And you can come to this realization, which is just crucially important, is that you cannot free yourself from duality through the powers of your own mind. As I've said, you can make some progress, because you can come to the point where I said your suffering becomes so intense, you say, I don't want to do this anymore, there must be a way out. Or you can come to use your rational mind to see that there are inconsistencies in what the ego is projecting at you, or even there are inconsistencies in duality. But as I also try to explain, going into separation is just an experience. And it's an experience that's created entirely in your own mind. So now you can ask yourself a question. Is there a different type of experience? It's like you can say, you're going into a movie theater and there's a comedy playing. Light-hearted comedy. But then after the comedy is over, you stay for the late show and now it's a horror movie. Two very different experiences you're having. But so you could say, if you are thinking in terms of reality, you can say, is the comedy real or is the horror movie real? And then you can come to say, well, maybe none of them are real. Maybe they're just make-believe. And then you can ask yourself, well, is there then an experience that isn't make-believe? And then you realize, yes, but in order to have that experience, I have to leave the movie theater, because there's a real world outside. So what I'm saying is, you can come to that realization where the experiences you are having in separation and duality are entirely created in your own mind and in a collective mind. But they are entirely created in the mind. Is there an alternative to this? Yes. What is the alternative to experiences that are entirely created by the mind? It must be an experience of a world or a reality that is not created by the mind, that is outside the mind. And that is, of course, what you started out with in life when you saw yourself as connected being. You experienced you were connected to something outside your own mind, that there was something outside your own mind. And the only way to be free of the experience that is created entirely in your own mind is to reconnect to the reality that's outside your mind. That's what I've been trying to explain. And when you reconnect to that reality, you realize that the conscious you is not the contents of the four lower bodies. It can step outside and experience the world neutrally. But as you become more familiar with that experience, you see that you're not existing in a vacuum. You're just not floating around in empty space. You are actually connected to your higher self. You're an extension of the higher self. And you're also connected to the beings in the higher realm, the spiritual realm, which I call the Ascended Masters. So, in other words, the only way out of duality is to connect to a higher self and to the Ascended Masters, because they represent the one mind, the Christ mind, to us here on earth. And that gives you a frame of reference whereby you can unravel the specific illusions that the ego has projected at you, and you can unravel the sense of reality, because now you have an alternative. You see that there's something that's more real than what you have created in the mind. But in order to do this, you have to be willing to question something. And it's a little tricky to see this. So, you have, as I said, the ego will shapeshift. So the ego, if you don't believe in one dualistic extreme, it will shift to the other. So let's say, let's again go back to this. You go into separation. And it's an experience that's created entirely in the mind. But in order for the experience to seem real, you can't be aware that this is something you created in your mind. It's again, you go into a reality simulator or you put on these virtual reality goggles. In order to have an absolutely real experience, you must forget that you put on the goggles and think the only world is what you see in the goggles. So what is the ego doing? It is projecting that you are a real being as a separate self, and that you live in a real world that was not created by your mind. You see, you go into separation, it's like going into this virtually created world that was entirely created by your own mind, or at least by the mind. But the projection is that it wasn't created by the mind, it's the real world. That's how the world is. So the immediate projection of the ego is you're living in a real world, the physical world is real, the universe is a certain way, and it functions that way. And it might very well be it was created by God, a God up there in the sky. So there's a specific belief about how the world was created, a religion, but beyond that is this projection. It's a real world. It wasn't created by your mind, there's nothing you can do about it. You can either accept it or not accept it. But in order to get out of duality, you have to question the reality of what the ego is projecting. And the ego is projecting there's an external world that wasn't created by your mind. And that's what you have to question. But now, the ego, when you come to a point where you start questioning it, the ego is not going to roll over and die. The ego is not going to give up. So it's going to try to flip you to another opposite extreme. And the first one may be, as I said, you believe the world was created by God, you come to question this. No, the world was created by laws of nature and so forth, science. But beyond this, you can come to question the reality of the world. And the ego will now say, oh yes, you're right. This was an illusion. Nothing is real. Nothing exists. And that's when you can fall into this trap that I've talked about in many of my non-duality videos and also here in the duality videos, of believing that only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. So in other words, nothing that you experience, nothing that you ever could experience is unreal. Why? Because you are unreal. The self is unreal. Now, the reality is the separate self is unreal. Yes. But there's a real self beyond the separate self. And that real self is real, the conscious you, the higher self. It is real because it's an extension of the Creator's being. So really, what the ego is always projecting is there's a reality out there. Either the world is real or the world is not real and nothing is real. But what you experience when you connect to the one mind, the Christ mind, is there's a reality outside what the ego can see because the ego can only see duality. You can come to question the reality of the separate self. But you don't have to flip into the other opposite dualistic extreme and say that means there's no self. You can come to question the reality of the world. But it doesn't mean you have to flip into the opposite dualistic extreme and say, oh, then nothing is real. There is no world. Anything that's differentiated is a duality. Anything that's differentiated is an illusion. Only the undifferentiated Brahman is real. That's duality. That's a projection of the ego. The alternative is to realize that when you go into duality and separation, everything you experience there is created in your mind and in the collective mind. It's created in the mind. But there's an alternative to this experience, namely a reality that was not created by your mind or the collective mind of beings on earth. Now you can, if you really want to go to deeper levels, you can say, well, how was that reality created then? Well, it was created by the minds of ascended masters in the spiritual realm. And they were created by ascended masters in a higher spiritual realm, and this goes all the way to the Creator, as I explained in my video about how the world was created. So ultimately, everything was created by the Creator, created out of its own mind. So everything is a creation of mind. That's correct. Everything is a creation of mind. But it's just that you have to make the distinction between us who are in an unascended sphere, who have not become ascended masters, and then ascended masters who are permanent beings because they have united with the one mind. They have given up the desire to be separate beings. So they are seeking to raise the whole. And that's why what was created by them has a, let's say, it's not real in the sense that it's permanent and will never change, but it is real compared to anything you create out of separation and duality. And I know this sounds awfully theoretical, but let me just try and illustrate it. Okay? So, this is an apple. It's real. It's not real in the sense that it's permanent. Okay? It has a limited lifespan. It obviously grew on a tree. But it's real insofar as there is a real planet Earth that we are living on. And that planet was originally, in its original pure state, created by ascended masters who have a much higher level of awareness than we do. Now the planet has been, as I said, it has descended from its original natural state to its current unnatural state, which is why we see a lot of limitations on Earth. But for the purposes of illustrating duality, which is what I'm trying to do here, this apple was not created by my mind. Okay? It grew on a tree somewhere, somebody picked it, it was shipped to a store where I bought it, and here it is. So my mind did not create this apple. So it is possible for me, even at the physical level, to have an experience of something that was not created by my mind. And that's what we have when we experience the world. I know there are non-dual teachers who will say, well, the world is entirely created in our minds. And everything we see is created in our minds. But that's not true. That's not correct. There is a world that we live in. I have, in some videos, I compared this world to a reality simulator, where I said we go inside a flight simulator and we think we are in a real airplane and flying a real airplane, but we're still sitting on the ground. So the experience of flying is not real, but there is a simulator. The Earth is a reality simulator. It was created by some beings with a greater minds than ours, and it was programmed to give us certain experiences by these greater minds. So the apple is real. However, what duality does is it superimposes a dualistic, value-driven image upon the physical reality we experience. So take the apple. Let's say I like apples, you don't like apples. This is just a physical sensation, the taste, when you take a bite. And the explanation is simply, your taste buds are different than mine. So, you experience, I don't like apples, I experience, I like apples. That's not duality. It's individual, it's not really duality. But it can become dualistic if you say, oh, I don't like apples, they're bad. That's a dualistic value judgment. Centered around you, because the fact that you don't like something means it's bad. You could just be neutral about it. I don't like apples, that's it. You could also have a situation where, let's say, you don't like apples, but your mother thought apples are healthy, so she forced you to eat what you don't like. And therefore, you are associating apples with something negative with being forced. That's also a dualistic overlay. But now there's an even deeper level. For many people who have grown up in a culture based on the Old Testament, they have often seen these images of Adam and Eve, where Adam is holding up a fruit, or Eve is holding up a fruit and showing it to Adam, the forbidden fruit. And on many of these paintings, it looks like an apple. So there are people who think that, oh, apples are bad. Apples is what caused the fall of humankind. It's caused all of our problems. We should avoid apples. They are of the devil. That's a dualistic overlay, projected upon something that's just a thing. Just a neutral thing. Now, you can also say, what can I do with an apple? And normally you would eat it. But you have this old saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away if you hit him. So in other words, I could throw this apple at somebody and hurt them. Well, that would also be a dualistic use of what's here. It's like they always say, guns don't kill, people kill. So what I'm trying to show you here is that even our physical senses, even our normal life experience, shows us there is something outside our minds, a reality outside our minds, that was not created by our minds. And then the way we look at that something, whether we think an apple is the cause of all of humankind's problems or just a fruit, that is produced in our minds or in a collective mind. And that's the difference. So that's really the beginning levels. So even at the physical level, and you can say, if you look at science, right? Science as we know it today emerged in medieval Europe that was dominated by the Catholic Church. And as I said, the Catholic Church had, first of all, projected the Catholic Church is the only road to salvation. And the Catholic Church has doctrines, but because the Catholic Church is the only true Church of Christ and the Pope is the Vicar of Christ, Catholic doctrines are infallible. And therefore they had projected that because a circle is the perfect geometric shape, they thought, it follows that since the heavens up there were created by God and God can only create perfection, the heavenly bodies, the sun and the other planets, they must be moving in perfect circles around the earth that is the center of the universe, because we are so important to God that God put us in the center of His creation. Now, as I said, there is a sun, there's a moon, there are no heavenly bodies, they are moving. That's real enough. But the Catholic doctrine was just a dualistic projection upon this reality that we experience. So here comes the first scientists, and they create the telescopes so they can observe these heavenly bodies more precisely, and they begin to record what they're finding, and they're thinking, gosh, doesn't look like the moon is moving in a circular orbit. It looks like it's moving in an elliptical orbit. And the Catholic Church now says, heresy, heresy. And why? Because if one particular doctrine is questioned, it questions the entire claim to infallibility. And that's how the ego reacts. The ego projects specifics, but if one of those specifics is questioned, then the ego will feel threatened, and first it will try to browbeat you into not accepting that specific question. But if it can't stop you, then it will turn around on a dime, and now it will embrace it, as the Catholic Church did with scientific findings eventually. Didn't help Galileo and Giordano Bruno very much, but then eventually they turned around, as the ego will also do. But I'm just saying again, when scientists discovered this, the reality of how the heavenly bodies move compared to our previous perception of it, that was a step up to a higher level of awareness. It was a step towards freeing ourselves from duality. And therefore there's some reality to materialists who will say that clearly this religious doctrines of the Middle Ages was superstition. And clearly science has discovered some more real observations of the universe. What I'm saying also is that when you then use this to say, this means all spirituality is an illusion and there's nothing beyond the material universe, then you have created another dualistic overlay that you're projecting upon science. So you see again how duality distorts everything. So basically what I wanted to get to with this video is that the ego can only think and see duality. And in duality there are always two opposites. So first the ego will project, it'll pick one opposite and it'll project this is the ultimate reality. When you, the conscious you, begin to question that, first the ego will try to beat you into submission so you don't dare to question it. But if it can't stop you from questioning it, it'll try to polarize you towards the other extreme. If you question religion, it'll polarize you towards scientific materialism. And when you begin to see this, the ego is projecting, the ego is always projecting. One of the dualistic polarities has to be true. If you don't believe in religion anymore, then at least believe in scientific materialism. One of them has got to be true. Why? Because the ego can't see anything else. The ego can never experience the Christ mind. Because the ego was born out of separation and duality. It cannot see the Christ mind as an alternative to a dualistic view of the world. It can only see the dualistic. And the ego, if you begin to believe in the concept of the Christ mind, it will even project that there's still a dualistic polarity. I have in my video about how the world was created, I talk about these beings who have completely rebelled against the purpose of creation. I call them fallen beings because they have fallen through different spheres. And they believe they are very advanced. They're seeking to raise the separate self to a godlike status where it knows better than God how the universe should work. And they will project, when you hear about the concept of Christhood, for example, they will project that, oh yeah, there is this Christ mind, but there is also an anti-Christ mind. And therefore, the Christ mind is just in the dualistic polarity with the anti-Christ mind. There are even Gnostic teachings that talk about there's a God and there's a demiurge. So the world was created as a duality between good and bad, between two dualistic polarities. This is what will be projected at you. But the reality here is that the Christ mind is the unifying mind. It has no opposite. It's not in a dualistic polarity with anything. And what does that mean? That means the mind of Antichrist, even though it's seeking to oppose oneness and always validate separation, it's not in a dualistic polarity with the mind of Christ. Because the mind of Antichrist can't see the mind of Christ. It can't experience it. So what does it do? It creates an image that there is the Antichrist mind, that's one polarity, and the Christ mind, that's another. But the image of Christ created in the mind of separation and duality is just an illusion. It's not the real Christ. This incidentally explains why the Christian religion has gone so far away from Jesus' original teachings, and why, if you look at the history of the Christian religion, starting with the Catholic Church, there's hardly any influence on earth that has been more dualistic than the Christian religion. And that obviously wasn't what Jesus intended, and not what he preached either. But anyway, the point here is that anything you come up with, any concept that you might read in a spiritual teaching, your ego is going to color it. Your ego is trying to distort it and pull it into you seeing it as, it's just an opposite, it's just another polarity. And that's why it will eventually hope to get you into this where if you don't believe in this polarity, if you don't believe in that polarity, if you don't believe in a third thing, you believe in nothing. You think everything is unreal. And therefore, nothing matters. Now again, I've said this before, you can find YouTube videos out there of people who have followed the non-dual teachers for years, and the non-dual teachers who are saying this. Nothing is real, nothing really matters, everything is an illusion. And these people got depressed, even suicidal. And this is what the ego will do, because rather than have you awaken to the reality of the one mind, the ego would rather have you end up in a mental institution in a straitjacket. This is how the ego works. The ego has no concern for you. It only has concern for itself, and it can only continue to survive if you do not connect to the one mind. And it would rather have you go insane than connect to the one mind. And incidentally, the fallen beings would also rather have you go insane than having you manifest Christ and express it on earth. That's why they killed Jesus, because he became a threat to them. So anyway, what I'm saying is that it's essential to realize that life does have a purpose. There is something that's real. And there is a self that's the core of your being that is real. It's not correct that the world is an illusion, that the self is an illusion, and therefore any sense of purpose is an illusion. No. The transcendence of self, the rising of awareness to a higher sense of self, that is real, and that is the purpose of life. And that's the purpose of your existence. And as I've said before, just tune in to your heart when you are hearing me say this. And see if there isn't a certain sense of relief, of raising of the energy, a certain sense of enthusiasm in you. When you hear me say this, there is something that's real. Life has a purpose. There is a part of you that's real. If you don't feel this, fine. You just go and find whatever appeals to you. But if you do experience this, it's because you have started to overcome duality. You have started to overcome the illusion that your own mind can define what's real and unreal, and you've started intuitively realizing that there's a reality outside of your own mind and that you can connect to it. You have started connecting to it. I'm just putting words on it. If this is new to you, then I'm just putting words on what you already experience intuitively. So embrace that intuitive feeling. If my words help you gain clarity, by all means pursue it. There are a lot of teachings that the Ascended Masters have given through me in all of my books and on all my websites that you can easily find that can help you. But if my words don't really do it for you, then seek out some other teaching that does it. But keep this in mind. Your mind has the ability to give you an experience that is entirely created in the mind, but that seems real. But you also, the conscious you, have the ability to step outside of that experience and directly experience that there is a greater reality that was not created by your mind. And the only way to be free of the illusions created by your mind is to connect to that greater reality that is not created by your mind.